Only that. All right. I'm required to inform everybody that we are recording this. So you are informed. My interpretation of Ring World by Larry Niven, just in case anybody's wondering. The way that I've done this before with the Teams meeting is I want people to know that it's not a requirement to be on here live, but I have found that the people that more often than not get on the Teams call live are also the same kind of people with the work ethic to get A's. And I'm just saying that it's not entirely it's not at all one-to-one correspondence. There's a lot of people that watch the recordings that get A's too. It's interesting to me that there's a greater percentage of people that get on the online calls that get A's than otherwise. So, and it's not, and you guys aren't earning extra credit for doing it or brownie points or anything.
I was gonna say I could prove you wrong because I'll show up and not get an A.
I appreciate that because it would be the exception that proves the rest of the rule. Okay, let's see. I am. All right. I set this up. The way that I operate these online classes, there are due dates and things like that. I generally the due dates are kind of sort of arbitrary. Um, I have I have a policy in there too about no late assignments and everything, but mostly that's so that I can legally get the people that are jerks. I Whenever anybody tells me what's going on and stuff like that, I have never not extended a deadline, and I am pretty flexible too because you guys are taking online class because there's real life, and so it doesn't bother me at all if things come in a little bit late or what the due dates are there primarily for you to be notified by Canvas that things are coming up so you can stay on top of things, and that's what it's there for. Any assignment that you do, if you don't get a perfect score, you look at the comments that I've made and you can resubmit and return it in as many times as you need to get a perfect score, right up until the so I will try to stay on top of it, but like I said, it doesn't hurt my feelings if you don't. Just do the best you can is what I'm saying. My brain is kind of like a pachinko machine, and so I try to calm things down and organize it in the modules, and solid 60% organized. There'll be things where it may not seem entirely lineal because that's not how I think. We'll be doing something and I'll remember, oh, we need to readdress this issue or circle around and get back to it again. So that because it's important to have that refreshed as we go on to something else. And I relate an awful lot of different things as we go on. And so, in the course of one Teams call, we may talk about everything from Eric von Daniken and the Jomon culture and ancient aliens, all the way to how pyramids were built in every culture on the planet that had significant technology.
Awesome.
It's not evidence that, sadly, it does not prove that alien overlords interacted with everybody. All it proves is that humans like to build stuff. And I think one of the when I started looking into art history and doing stuff like that, I had a teacher that took me aside, and she basically said, "Bless your heart." Bless your heart is Southern for you're kind of an idiot. But she said, "Bless your heart. I see what you're trying to do, but if you're making comparisons in art history, you have to make sure that you differentiate between independent parallels and actual cross-pollination." So if we find evidence that one culture informed somebody else or one artist interacted with somebody else or there's a letter or something like that, that means something completely different than if two people came up with the same idea independently. And one thing that really, really frustrates me on these pseudo scholarly TV shows that I enjoy watching is when somebody sees parallels in language or architecture or expression, they assume a connection that isn't there.
I, I'm a very firm believer that correlation always equals causation.
Well, I am a big fan of Rupert Sheldrake and Carl Jung. There is something very significant to what they had to say, and I think it's even provable with contemporary string theory and modern physics. But if we're writing papers about it and we're trying to justify a stance, it's best to be really clear about what we say as regarding parallels as opposed to unless you're Joey, direct causation.
Yes.
A good example of this is the Yavapai and Yemenese architecture from about 2,000 years and Yavapai architecture from about 1,000 years ago. They built identically shaped tower homes that, since they lived in the same kind of arid, low water areas, these tower homes are designed to be built over springs or minimal water sources to create and generate kind of an internal airflow, creating a self-sustaining air conditioning. And the buildings look absolutely identical. Sadly, it's not evidence of any alien interaction. It's just evidence that people are smart and they come up with similar solutions when they're faced with problems. That's it. Okay, that particular ramble is over, but there will be more. Okay, here we go. Does anybody know who this guy is?
No.
This painter? His name is Paul Klee.
Oh yeah.
And most of his watercolor is not because he did stuff for collectors. Most of his surviving watercolors are because of his demonstrations he did for the classes he taught at the Bauhaus. But I think his stuff is pretty indicative of the kind of take that I have in this class, which is 20th century art is its own thing, but it's firmly based on everything that was done before. And it comes as a result of everything that was done before. Look at this. There's an awful lot going on that deals with everything from pattern piece quilting, which has some of its roots in Eastern Europe, where Paul Klee was from, all the way to Roman mosaic and contemporary color theory that was actually developed through the Bauhaus and then distorted and used by the Germans for propaganda. But this, so this ties into a lot of different things. And again, it's very modern. So that's one of the reasons why I use it. I really liked it. Okay. Everything's quiet because I'm trying to navigate the technology behind our Canvas systems. Okay, this is me. I wanted to give a little bit of background on myself. I have a discussion board up that everybody can go to and put a little bit about themselves. I didn't intend for people to take the question so literally. Everybody has been talking about their go-to karaoke songs, which mine, of course, is Tequila. That's the only one that I can do.
Yes.
But it's when people are talking about dancing to Lady Gaga while they're singing, I have nothing but admiration for that kind of self-awareness of personal character that allows someone to do that. My background is really a patchwork of different things. Over here, I've done a lot of different things. At BYU, I started as an architecture student and was in civil engineering and then computer programming. And then there was, of course, the natural and absolutely obvious shift to stained glass and watercolor. And I've been doing stained glass for about 40 years. The reason I became a professional stained glass artist is that the guy who hired me was so sick and tired that he had to keep quitting what he was doing just to ring me out on the till, that he gave me a job so I could ring myself out. And that's how I started getting paid to do it. But over the last 40 years, I have screwed up in pretty much every conceivable way. And now I'm used as a resource and consultant to fix problems that other people have done without that same level of, how can we say? I want to say embarrassment, but I think it sounds better if I say experience. And I've been able to go to a couple different countries to consult. Like I went to China to show people how to do windows in Chinese factories in a style that looked like European stained glass. And if you go to the church's art museum, oh, that's interesting. The reverb. If you go to the church's art museum in Salt Lake, all the stained glass in there is stuff that I curated.
Wow.
So it can withstand the test of time. BYU Museum curating their glass as well. Most of the tabernacles along the Wasatch Front, I've done repair work, restoration work for them too. About 20 years ago, after 9/11 hit, I started exploring different kinds of faiths, specifically learning about Islam. And then I turned that into, nobody wanted to hear what I was doing, so I started making stained glass sculptures on what I was learning. And not trying to Christianize what I was finding, but trying to show stuff within the cultural context that I was learning. And one of the exhibits I had at BYU, I found out a friend of mine was actually kicked out of BYU because looking at the sculptures, he decided he needed to become Muslim instead of Mormon. Which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm glad that he did what he needed to do to be happy. But that led to a fellowship where I studied art and philosophy in Iran, as well as completing a chaplaincy program to become a pluralist chaplain. So, and now I'm a member of things like the Ibn Arabi Society, and I'm a Rumi scholar, and all this other stuff in addition to doing stained glass here. So lots of different kinds of stuff. And some of the people I'll reference are philosophers you may or may not have heard of, like Ibn Khaldun, who is the godfather of contemporary museology and social studies, so the social sciences, as well as other philosophers too. Like one of my favorites is Heidegger, who was a phenomenologist and the kindest and gentlest of the Nazi philosophers. So that's a good thing. But that's my background. 4 hours of sleep a night, you get a lot of reading done. The reason I kind of say all that is so that you know that where I'm coming, I have this brain like a pachinko machine, but a lot of these things, I make a lot of these connections, and some of them are half-assed, some of them are pretty sturdy, but it's because I notice a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that I recognize is that, well, I guess it can be illustrated by this kind of a thing. What survives from humanity from 10,000 years ago? We've got, Stonehenge is 3,500 years old. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex built during the Younger Dryas event, which is at the tail end of the last ice age. So that's almost 12,000 years old. And these are temples. These are beautiful structures. 10,000 years from now, do you know what the only thing that will survive from our society will be? Cubic miles of disposable diapers. If the things that last are important to a culture, and we see all these temples, what are our ancestors going to be thinking about us in 10 millennia? That we worshipped with the diapers? I think that's pretty horrible. But we consider ourselves the best and the brightest, whoever we is, whatever that group is, because in order to survive, we're trained to be ethnocentric. We have to be. That's how we're designed. But our biases does not mean that we're the best. Our way of thinking does not mean that it is universally the best. When somebody is different, it doesn't mean that they're stupid or slow or idiots. It just means that they're different, and that's it. So as we look at different stuff, that's a perspective that's really important to keep. When we look at different things, we need to, if we want to evaluate it appropriately, we need to examine it from within the context as much as possible that we're aware of our own biases, and we want to learn as much as possible about the context of the artist and the culture and the material set within which that, whatever it is built. And then we can get a pretty fair understanding. It is rather frustrating when you're trying to listen to somebody who is telling you about how stupid somebody else is, and their valuation for that other person's stupidity is because they're not them, and that's it. That gets rather old. And there's some interesting things that I mentioned in here. We talked about how smooth and polished we can get a stone sphere, and there's not a lot of energy into producing it because our technology is so good. But you look at the temple stones at Baalbek, and there's a couple of particular stones that our ancestors actually cut and moved, even from the earth movers that were specially designed and built to construct the Three Gorges Dam in China. They are not big enough. And then the biggest earth movers on the planet, they are not big enough to move these stones. So somehow our ancestors did stuff that we could not. And that's just something to keep in mind.
Um, Andrew, what do you think? How did they do it?
One thing that is really fascinates me is this pervasive assumption that we don't even realize we're assuming regarding our own cultural context. That technology is evaluated as less or more specifically in relation to what we can do today. And there is evidence of places like the cave complex in Malta, and there's another one in Cappadocia in Turkey, where people built these underground structures thousands of years ago without any of the tools that we're used to seeing today, where it demonstrates a very specific awareness of sound and sound reverberation, sonics. Somehow, like for example, every planetary body has its own specific resonating frequency, and that of Earth is, I think it's 432 hertz. And what is fascinating, though, is as we use electricity and machine technology, that frequency gradually changes until we're surrounded by a 440 hertz frequency. And this is unsettling enough to our bodies that we're designed to live in the 432 hertz frequency that it may go a significant direction towards explaining things like fibromyalgia, and chronic pain and migraines. It's fascinating that in Malta, in this cave complex, and then also in Cappadocia, there are specific areas that are engineered to reverberate a frequency that returns to that 432 hertz. So it makes you wonder, how did they know that? How did they do that? What are they doing? And even something that's less of a mystery, masks used in Greek theater were designed specifically so that the mouthpiece would project sound and increase people's awareness of enunciation and volume several times what the actor could do just by themselves. And this is a little piece of wood that's only like 4 inches thick, but it's able to do that. And then there's also the reverberating air. I don't know if you guys have ever taken a tissue paper, like a Kleenex box, you put a new piece of tag board on it so that you cover the hole with a circle that's about an inch in diameter, and then you can hold this box up, tap the back, and people 3 feet away can feel the air. And which is something that's really interesting. But that's technology that the Romans explored and used with fluid dynamics so that their aqueduct system could pump water uphill in a completely static environment. It was a solid state static environment, and it used native pressure and awareness of pressure differentials to engineer the water pumping uphill. And this is, 2,500 years ago. So I just, again, goes back to the idea, old is not stupid. Because they didn't have cell phones and diapers doesn't mean they were dumb. And, we're not exploring prehistory of art or art from 1,000 years ago, but a lot of that does make it into the art that we're looking at, which is of, more of a modern contemporary era, the 20th century. And we're going to be looking at enough different things from around the planet and enough different perspectives of what goes into creating stuff that is labeled art, that I think it's really important to suspend the habits that we have of using our biases as a crutch against intellectual exploration. But, something to think about, or not, whatever, it could be BS, but that's the perspective that I'd like to follow. So, you guys buy any of that? Because even though it sounds like I did not pull any of that out of my ear.
I love that, Andrew. I think it's really interesting to think about um, the different pathways that people have gone down for technology instead of moving directions that we're aware.
Well, I think it's really fascinating that engineering principles have been around and explored by pretty much every culture on the planet. And just as an example, Joey might be interested, the camera obscura, there's evidence that was being used during the Renaissance. But I read a paper just about 3 months ago, written where a person analyzed the allegory of the cave, written by Plato. And he said that it looked she said that it looked very much like this. He was aware of what a camera obscura could do. They definitely had the technology at that time as well to create a camera obscura. And, it's another thing that really boggles me, and then we'll get into the rest of the lesson so that validate your time. But Dr. Snow, who was one of the founders of contemporary nuclear physics, in the 1980s, he wrote a couple of papers, gave a couple lectures regarding the application of the Platonic solids to the ways that atoms connect to each other. I don't know if you remember your periodic table of the elements, but on that you see that there's these vertical rows of elements that will attach with 4 vertices, then 6 vertices, 8 vertices, these specific numbers, and they relate directly to the geometry described in the Platonic solids that Plato talked about, where you have these 5 shapes that are all defined by the same flat shape being used over and over again, where all the lines are the same length. It's a completely consistent form. What's fascinating about that is if the Ashmolean Museum in the UK has examples of these Platonic solids or atom models, models of the atoms that we're familiar with today that date back to Neolithic times that were found in Ireland and Scotland. So they had the Platonic solids, these models of atoms that are 20,000 years old. I mean, if that doesn't keep you awake at night, I don't know what will. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. You guys have all heard the phrase close looking. That seems to be the catchphrase used at this university for intentional thinking. If I talk about words like critique or critical, what is the first emotion that comes to mind? Is it positive or negative?
Negative.
Very negative. When you hear words like critical or critique, suddenly you know somebody's going to call you on the carpet and tell you how you screwed up. I think that's horrible. Critical actually means with intent, intentional. It does not mean negative or tearing flesh or anything else that we can associate with it. It is it's a positive way of approaching something because you're approaching it with specific intent to your thinking. So there's 4 tools that I like to use in a process of artistic critique that lead to this. And before we go into these, I want you to just react to this for just a moment. If you bring something that you've made to somebody and you say, how do you like this? And they say, oh, it's nice. Oh, it's pretty. Yeah, that's kind of positive, like a little warm fuzzy. But if you say instead, it's obvious that you're very aware of the assignment, and it's very apparent to me that you spent a lot of time in this. I like how you use the materials. The marks on it are fascinating. It gives us this texture that really involves me, and I want to see more of the texture. Your color use is extraordinary. I mean, this makes me feel as if I'm becoming part of the artwork just by looking at it and holding it. I think it's wonderful. Would you rather hear that, or would you rather hear, oh, that's nice? You know, and this is where we go into these tools of artistic critique. So I'm going to go through each of these tools really quick, and I want you to think about the bridge from one tool to the next and what is happening as we approach the 4th tool. The first one, description. We are talking about what we see, what we encounter, and the effect that this object has in our shared environment. And that's it. If we know the artist, we list that. But we're talking about materials, texture, height, weight, shapes, the colors that it possesses, the rhythms that we see, these kinds of things. It is the part of description. We're not talking about how we feel about it. We're just talking about the evidence of the shared encounter with whatever that object is. When we go to analysis, in this step of the process, we are trying to imagine how the artist or creator or originator of that object or thing did what they did. This is where, you know, if the object is made out of plastic, maybe we'll talk about how the molds were shaped. If the object is made out of wood, maybe in this one we'll talk about whether it's or not it's natural wood that has been mildly adjusted, or if it looks like it's been machined or hand carved. This is where we talk about how the marks were made, how it was painted, you know, how it was adjusted or sculpted. When we move to, and this is how we imagine the artist created it. We move to interpretation. This is when we start taking into account being very aware of our own biases, and also being aware that whoever made or whatever made that other thing, they had their own world that they lived in, their culture that they're from as well. So this is where we start extrapolating things like, how did their worldview inform what they made? Does it have a meaning? If it does, is the meaning something that the artist expects me to apply? Or is the artist trying to communicate with me through the meaning that they are applying? And then the last one, evaluation. This is where we decide whether or not it was successful. Does the thing feel like it was made well enough to stand the test of time? Does it feel like it's appropriate to the context for which it was intended? Does it communicate what we feel the artist intended to communicate? Or does it feel that the artist just got halfway there? So each of those 4 steps, describe, analyze, interpret, and evaluate, it's important that they go in that sequence, you know, one after another. But what is the biggest difference between describe and evaluate that you can see during that process? I would say it's insertion of the self. How much of yourself is involved in the described process? I mean, you're just sharing, you're using your vocabulary to share what's observed, and that's it. The second one, analysis, how much of yourself is used? You start imagining how they made it. Then when you get to interpretation, then you start thinking and putting yourself in the shoes of the individual who created it in the first place. Start thinking how it fits within their culture, their worldview. Uh, what could it possibly mean to you, and what could it possibly have meant to the person who made it? So it's even more of yourself in that. You're exploring the why. And then the last one, evaluate. That is almost entirely you. So as we go through this 4-step process, we're expressing more and more of our own self in this process and kind of connecting with whoever or whatever made that original object. And I think it's a really good way of helping us to appreciate the effort that went into it. Because by the time we get to things like conceptual art, a lot of you will think, oh, that is such a bunch of garbage. But whether or not you like the art, I don't really care. It makes a lot more, it's a lot more important to me that we all get to the point where we can appreciate the effort that somebody goes through, the thought that goes into it, the culture that produces it, how they're reacting, what they're trying to say from their personal perspective. Whether or not we like it doesn't really matter. And what I say that, but what's fascinating is that almost all the time, when we put ourselves in other people's shoes and develop them as a real human being who created something or generated something, we start getting to the point where we can really not just appreciate but enjoy what they make as well. I think it's a fascinating transition, and sometimes it's a little scary. But at the end of that section of the module, I have a video where it demonstrates how to apply this with a Henry Moore sculpture. And I really like it because as you go through it, you can kind of see how they transition from one step to the next through the process. And most of the students who have watched that video, most of them just don't like Henry Moore at all. But by the end of it, they get to the point where they actually respect what he was doing, whether or not they like the artwork. Now, there's something that we're going to, I am not an art historian. I'm a studio artist. And so my approach to art history is hopefully less boring, but it is definitely different. Instead of quizzes and memorization for the things that we look at, every week we're going to do weekly reflections, and we'll talk about that before we end tonight. But every 2 weeks we're going to be doing projects, and these are either discovery or research projects, and they are almost entirely self-directed, with the most important element being that you are able to articulate and justify how the project that you did relates to the material in the class. It has to relate to the course. Now, your projects could be on all sorts of different things, and we'll talk about that. Let me share my screen again. This is the assignment, the challenge moving forward. There are going to be 6 projects that are 3 to 5 hours each, and 1 project, your final capstone project, that's 10 hours. And that final capstone project I've had several students do things where it comprised of 3 different shorter related projects that they all put together, and that works just fine. If these things only take 3 to 4 hours a piece to do that final 10 hours, that is perfectly fine. But as you do this, there's some things that I want you to keep in mind. It needs to be something that, or hopefully it will be something that you can ideally start and finish within a 2-week period or less. It needs to be incredibly cheap to accomplish. National average for a class like this is anywhere from $150 to $250 with textbooks and stuff like that. You notice that I'm not requiring anybody to get a textbook. You can buy them if you want, but I don't think we need to. The internet is astounding, especially Wikipedia. Actually, I'm joking about that. Don't use Wikipedia in your research. But it needs to be incredibly cheap to accomplish, and it needs to focus on something that we visit or touch on during the course of the class that we're doing. And I'm hoping that there will be a variety in the project that you choose to pursue. I kind of force this variety a little bit. There has to be a minimum of 2 research projects and a minimum of 2 discovery projects as we do this, and I'll explain what the difference is. The discovery projects are things that you take an active role in pursuing. One discovery project can be volunteering for 3 to 5 hours at a local gallery. And that is, if you want to do that, hands down, that is a given. You get credit for it as one of the projects. The other projects might be, maybe you find you want to replicate Lee Krasner or Jackson Pollock and do a spatter painting. Maybe you want to explore geometry in watercolor and remake something like a Paul Klee painting. Or maybe you want to do a Wassily Kandinsky and paint while you're listening to music. He had synesthesia, and so a lot of his paintings are him painting what he sees and feels in a very literal way, because he would hear a French horn note and he would see yellow, kind of thing. And that's why his paintings look the way that they do. Or maybe you just really like melted beans, and so you want to replicate a Salvador Dali. That's fine too. Another approach to that might be, there's a museum you've heard about that has a whole bunch of Barbara Kruger stuff. So you go to that. Out of that 3 to 5 hours, 1 hour of it can be travel time. And then when you're there, get permission, take photos of it, and talk and share in a short presentation about your experience visiting the museum, and detail how it relates directly to the materials covered in the class. And that covers. So those are the kinds of experience projects that we do, or discovery projects. For research, maybe you're really fascinated by how Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock both were dealing with abstract expressionism, but they went in completely different directions. And maybe there's some interesting reasons you can find that kind of satisfy your curiosity about why that happened. Maybe you want to do a retrospective on what the Guerrilla Girls were doing during the 90s. Maybe you think Yoko Ono has the best singing voice in the history of mankind, and you want to collect a lot of her music. Then you put that together and present it in a PowerPoint. Or you could also do like an annotated bibliography. And I give directions about how to do these kinds of things to demonstrate just the research that you did. Yoko Ono is a pretty courageous artist, but the stuff that she does is very different than what the media popularizes. She's not like what people expect. But there are different ways of presenting these projects as well. You can do a paper where you have like maybe 8 photos embedded in the body of the paper, and you just talk about your experience and share it. Maybe in one of your discovery projects, you do a time lapse of the process of painting, of building one of these paintings, or the process of figuring out the geometry of an Art Deco panel, or of working on some of the more contemporary Art Nouveau detailing, and you do time lapse for that. You could also do a PowerPoint slideshow where you video the slides. And there is a way to make a video that you can record your voice on through PowerPoint itself. But if that doesn't work, you can also make a Teams call and do a screen share with the PowerPoint slides. And you could also do, I've had several students get those little tripods for their phones, set them up to take a film of their computer as they're going through the slides on their computer, and then their phone records their voice at the same time as they're talking about it. So there's lots of different ways. And all these are projects that can be done within that 3 to 5 hour window. And the average should be about 4 hours per project. So if one takes you 5 or 6 hours, make sure that the next one takes a lot less. So you have you sustain an average of about 4 hours per project. But what we need, the challenge is thinking about ideas. That's always a problem. So for that assignment, what I'll need you to do, I'm going to do the screen share again. Just wait a few short hours while I adjust my screen to share this. what everyone will need to do is submit a proposal through Canvas. And this is the example proposal where I have one sentence that is a very short summary of what the project is, then a paragraph that talks about the different kinds of things that somebody would do during making the project, and then a last sentence that talks about how long the project might take. A couple important points to remember is that one is, try to propose something that at least you think might possibly potentially be interesting. And another one is, this is not the project that you're doing. You don't have to ever do this in the course of the semester. It could just be something really fun that sounds really fun. This does not have to be one of your projects. But everybody will turn this in by Sunday night, and then as quickly as I can, I will put that in a document and open it up so that when you go to do your project, you'll have access to it. And hopefully it'll be, that decaying manure that farmers use to fertilize their fields, and fertilize your brain cells and give you some ideas to help you generate future projects. So again, you don't have to do that project. The project is not due on Sunday night. And I am going to be very flexible about when that first project is due. I have it on the 21st. Just, as soon as you can would be great, kind of thing, for this first one. But those ideas are there for people to look at to help them brainstorm and come up with different things. So, go through that material and see what you think about it. I am very good. I've worked a lot with the church over the years, the LDS Church. I've worked on a lot of temples, from everything from helping designers to come up with ideas that are actually practical, to doing reconstruction work and restoration work. During that entire process, I have learned several really nice ways of telling people that they're idiots. Telling people that they aren't thinking in maybe the best possible way. But I have learned that I have learned how to tie things together pretty well. So if you have a project idea, but you don't know how to fit that into the course material, ask me about it, and I can help you tweak it and justify it so it's firmly seated within the material that we cover.
How do you feel about collaboration?
What's that?
How do you feel about collaborating on?
Would you be collaborating with another student?
Yeah.
If you wanted to do that, I think that would be fine. But if you're going to do that, it would be important to make sure that both of you are keeping to the time requirement. So both of you working together would have to produce something that's 6 to 10 hours instead of a total of 3 to 5 hours. That way each of you would have the 3 to 5 hours. Do you know what I mean? Okay, and since you're both participating in the initial consultation with each other, then both of you would have that time counted. And then when you do your own part of it, that would count towards your time and not both. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think if you were able to do that and connect with somebody that followed through with you, I think that could be really interesting. That'd be fascinating. So yeah, definitely go for it. I wanted to mention how attendance works for this. After our Teams meeting, if you attended live, you can go to the attendance for this week, and you just need to record 5 things that you learned as we were talking. And it doesn't have to be directly related to the class. Like I've had people before say things like, we learned that Andrew has 3 dogs that could be really annoying. They scratch on the door while he's trying to give a presentation. Stuff like it doesn't really matter. It's just 5 things that evidenced that you were present today, and that's it. If you are listening to this as a recording, it's 5 things that you gathered from the recording. And it needs to be from the recording rather than from the overall material that we cover, because I have had people try to get credit for this by putting in course materials to ChatGPT and have that chat generate 5 observations, and that kind of defeats the point. you know, bless their heart. If I should also say about the things I'm doing on Fridays. Um, Friday afternoons, I've gotten permission to use that room 112, 1 to 3 on Friday afternoons for historical process workshops. And they're going to be a lot of different ones. The 3 this month are going to be, this Friday it's going to, I'm going to be talking about orthogons and sacred geometry. Then next Friday I'm going to be talking about sacred stars and an introduction to Islamic tessellation. And then the third Friday from now, I'm going to be talking about or demonstrating how to make ink from herbal tea. And each of those, the university doesn't cover any materials, so people need to bring their own. And I email, you know, what's necessary to the class beforehand. There is no obligation for anybody to show up. It is there entirely so that to help you generate ideas for your projects. And that's the primary reason that it's there. You can come or not, doesn't matter. Of course, my feelings will be hurt, but I'll get over it. And it does, if you miss attending one of my live classes, then they can count for attendance, but it doesn't have any effect on attendance on this class because you're going to be watching the lecture video. So, and it won't have, nobody in the art department will care whether or not you go to it for attendance for their class either. So, you know, it's entirely volunteer. Now, who's familiar with this quote from Leo Tolstoy? That art is a virus and our job as artists is to infect others. Have you guys heard of that before? That is my favorite quote. It was from Ananda Kumar Swami's book about spirituality and art. At the very beginning, his introduction to the body of the work, he references that about Leo Tolstoy. And I thought that was just absolutely wonderful. I like thinking about being a carrier of the aesthetic virus. I think that's wonderful. But I want, I think one of the things that is emblematic of 20th century art is there was this constant challenge or a constant energy given to exploring what art means, what makes art, to challenge preconceptions of art. The Dada movement is an excellent example of this, where Marc Chagall was so sickened by the fashion-driven gallery system that he tried to turn people's preconceptions of art on their heads and ended up actually getting death threats for some of the things he was doing. You know, we look back and think, oh, that's quaint, but that's because, you know, 4 generations afterwards, or 3 generations afterwards, we are surrounded by the sea of effects from what Marcel Duchamp did. I said Marc Chagall for it was Marcel Duchamp and the Dada movement. There's a couple observations I made in this. I can link you to papers that explore this, but I'm just going to say it's anecdotal observation. After the Enlightenment period of art in Europe brought us very directly to the Industrial Revolution. And during the period of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people died from diarrhea. I mean, that was one of the most common causes of death by workers in these factory towns. But one of the effects was that there was a huge amount of the population that had disposable income. And the Industrial Revolution also brought it to mind the possibility that you could mass produce things and create things on a scale that was before that completely unimagined. Islamic architecture in the 9th century started addressing a lot of those ideas and dealing with it, but it wasn't really a full-scale endeavor until the height of the Industrial Revolution, where you start getting things like mass-produced building materials, mass-produced plates, mass-produced flatware and silverware. mass-produce art even. This is where we start getting into the really inexpensive lithographs that were produced. For example, soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars, 1812, wars over in Turkey and the Baltic Sea, and then also coming up to the 1860 in the U.S., the war between North and South. A lot of the soldiers got their artwork because of the incredibly cheap lithography that was developed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So people could get really cheap stuff. I think that created an environment with this newfound disposable income that started turning people's relationship with art to an idea that art was a commodity. And we start seeing people produce art specifically for income, and people selling art specifically for income, not because a family was commissioning something, not because the church needed a lesson to be taught. It was specifically for income. And it seems to me pretty consistent with that idea that throughout the 19th century, art became more and more a prestige item, and less respected as something to develop in a healthy way the environment surrounding a person, and more as something that was a decoration. And of course, this is just completely anecdotal evidence, but I think it kind of stands up. When I talk about Durer, Pythagoras, Plato, and St. Augustine, each of these guys had a specifically articulated relationship to what they thought art was. You've no doubt heard the phrase, art imitates nature. I know you guys have heard that. The rest of the phrase, that's from Plato's Timaeus and Phaedo, those two dialogues. And what he's talking about is that art imitates nature, in that nature is the physical manifestation of the divine will, or the universal energy. And since we are products of the universe, we are intelligent, self-aware products, when we create something, we need to mimic that process as well, because we are already mimics of that universal intelligence. And so our art doesn't have to look like a tree, but it should imitate that process of a manifestation of our energy, intellect, and will. And he said it quite a bit more concisely. But my take on art is, whenever we undertake, you guys have all felt the flow state, right? You've done something where you come to, and after you realize 3 hours have passed, your butt's asleep, and you can no longer feel your feet because you've been working on something. That is because you are engaging in what Albrecht Dürer called spiritus, where you are actively seeking the help of something beyond your immediate ego-driven self to inform what you're creating. And when you do that, when you engage in an activity like that, you can't help but produce art. And art is the activity or evidence of that activity. So that means that an artist is anybody who engages that thing outside of their immediate self to help create. That means that you could be an artist while you're reading. That means that farming potatoes, cutting down a tree, doing topiary in your yard, or even lawn mowing, teaching kindergartners, teaching Cub Scouts, teaching Girl Scouts, singing. There's all sorts of stuff that are beyond traditional arts that then become art. And it's not just the artifact, it's also the process. That's how I view art. And I think that is particularly helpful as we move forward through the 20th century, because there are people that are doing stuff that my grandpa said made him want to vomit. And he also would say, well, anybody can do that. Yeah, anybody could, but the artist is the one who did it first. So we look at things like Yoko Ono inviting people to cut her clothing off. And what she's doing a performance piece where she is purposely creating an environment to force people to confront the idea that the feminine form is commodified. And suddenly it's not just somebody sitting on a stage asking people to do something at random. It becomes a really brave act to force people to confront this very real, dire situation that is, on ever present and ongoing in our society. Or Yves Klein did the very similar thing with his creation of Klein Blue and his painting with models, where he's addressing the very strong fact that the feminine form has become commodified. And we may not be able to point at a box that we can hang on a wall and say, this is the art expressing that, because those things only exist in the experience. But because art is, we're expanding art to mean the process as well, then that becomes art. We can very easily validate that as being art as well. Do you guys see where I'm going? I don't really care if you agree with me right now or not, because that's what the content of this lesson is based on. I hope you guys can see your way to agreeing with me, but if you don't, I'm sorry. One thing I want you to look at too is this idea between the difference between art periods and art movements. For the purposes of this class, the way that I've defined the separation, I think is pretty consistent with how a majority of art critics and art historians view the difference as well. One of the things that irritates me about art history and talking about it in an academic setting is that you use words that should function as synonyms, but they aren't, and it's frustrating to me. So this anti-synonym of period versus movement is basically an art period is art that is bounded by a segment of time within a culture. It's an expression of a culture over a specific period of time that kind of defines that culture. Like, for example, the early kingdom Egyptian period of art, medieval art, the Carolingian Renaissance art period, the Renaissance art period, the Baroque art period. All of those are things that are broadly categorized over a shared culture over a significant length of time. And a period is going to be anywhere from 50 years to millennia. Because you also get the prehistorical art period, which is anywhere from 50,000 to 15,000 years ago. So a very significant time period. And then we get to a movement, and a movement is more defined as it takes place as a subset within a culture over a very defined period of time because it's addressing specific ideas that emerge within that culture or specific issues which emerge within that culture. So in Europe, we get in the early 1800s the realism and romanticism movements that kind of fed off each other. We get after the an increased understanding of photography, we get Impressionism, which is kind of addressing a new awareness of just the physical properties and processes of our observation of the world around us. And well, who was it? Was it Rodin who said that the Impressionism would never have got its start if paint hadn't been sold in tubes? Was he the guy who said that? Brian found that quote, and I thought it was totally awesome. But the Industrial Revolution led directly to processes that allowed people to create paints and sell them overseas to other people. And paint was so cheaply produced that you had a whole new crop of artists that could try their hand at it. And that coupled with the newfound perception about reality through photography, and that went together to create Impressionism. And so we can see how these things are related and stuff, but that creates an art movement. We don't see Impressionism as a period, but conversely, we see modern art from, say, 1895 to 1999. We can see that generally as a period of art because the technologies necessary to create that art were pretty much in place by the end of the 19th century, and that's what informed everybody that did everything for the next 3 or 4 generations. So do you see the difference there? Okay, good. I know I'm beating I'm sorry for anybody who might be offended. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but Deal with it. Okay. Now I want to share this idea of semiotics, artifacts, and symbolism. Artifacts are the evidence of the art process. And you can read the rest of this thing on itself. Semiotics is the study of meaning, and symbolism is our awareness that something is going on behind the artifact that we encounter. An example I'm using is this. Do you guys recognize this image? This is during the 1950s, and until about 20 years ago, this was described as a cycladic idol. They're about foot-long structures carved in vaguely human form, not vaguely, very abstracted human form, and they were found in homes all around the Cyclades. And so, of course, because our ancestors were stupid and everything revolved around religion, because they couldn't think about anything higher than that, this had to be an idol, right? Well, if we consider that these are found in dwellings where people lived, they're about a foot, and when we do a foot long, and when we do microscopic analysis of this, we see that they were painted, and when we find them in situ, there is human hair used on the heads, and there is clothing made for these things that have mostly rotted away. Thinking about that and the placement, these are found in homes, painted to look like the people that played with, that used them, and clothes were made for them. I think we could also say just as equally that these might very well be Barbie dolls. They don't have to be idols. Now, if we find them in a home where people slept, there's a good chance it could be a doll. If we find them in a temple, then what might that say about it? What could it be?
The idol?
Yeah, it could be an idol if it's in a worship space. But there we are applying what we understand about meaning, extrapolating. So I think that that's a really good example of kind of separating ourselves from knee-jerk reactions to assuming that cultures are less developed than ours. They're just differently developed. And also assuming that an object is something specific, giving it a title that carries on and on for decades, that limits people's potential understanding. Another good example of this process is when the Americas were colonized. The empires and countries that were here, the kings and queens, emperors and empresses that were here, their titles were changed to tribes, tribal lands, and chieftains. Even though these people, some of the, like in the Sioux Nation network, there were parliaments that were voted for. You know, there was a democratic process that developed completely parallel to the democracy that we believe comes from the Greeks. You know, and as a way of avoiding the whole heads of state equality issue, the colonizers changed those titles to tribes, tribal lands, and chieftains to kind of avoid having to share respect. And it's interesting to me that those kinds of cultural misappropriations really limit future relation with whatever the object, thing, or subject is. You know, we have a vocabulary that limits our understanding. Heidegger talks a lot about that when he's discussing phenomenology. When he says, as soon as you use one word, there's 1,000 others that are blocked from use because you've closed the door on them, which I think is a pretty good way of looking at it. So when we look at things and try to establish meaning or so, it's a really good idea to be aware of our biases and try to take into account what we can find out potentially of the culture that originated the object or surrounded the artist who was creating the object, as well as the semiotics surrounding how the object might have been potentially used. Ibn Khaldun talked a lot about that too. He's the godfather of a lot of the soft sciences, the social sciences, as well as museology, and talked a lot about phenomenology too, about 700 years ago. With this one, there's just a short video about the history of art. in the year 1900, adults alive in the year 1900 started to see things like automobiles and bicycles. When when they were kids, those things were completely unheard of, if you can imagine that. I remember reading an article that I found in a British newspaper about how dangerous bicycles were to the natural order of things because it gave freedom to women who should be staying at home. Thought that I'm sure that guy was very unhappy for the next several months after he wrote that. But it's interesting to think about that kind of cultural development and the speed which technology expanded. Yeah, Joey.
Sorry, bicycles are the reason that women can
What's
wear.
that?
So bicycles are the reason women can wear.
Oh yeah, that's right. And something I bring up in a lot of my classes too is, we think the natural order is women have skirts and men have pants, but the Mesopotamian kings, the height of super masculine, ferocious, male-dominated fashion skirt, and women wore pants. I think I think people expect all the time. But when every decade would see this huge expansion of technology, and in a single lifetime, people could go from endangering your life and crossing a single ocean to traveling around the entire world in a matter of weeks, and from taking months to hear back from somebody to being able to talk to them over a cable under the Atlantic Ocean in moments. I mean, you can just imagine how discombobulating but also enervating that would be to the people involved and living at that time. And I think that goes a long ways in explaining how these art movements, they're only happen so quickly and rapidly and one after another, and also overlapping each other, because people in different areas like France and Czechoslovakia and Germany could talk to each other and interact with each other, and then coordinate an art show where they would all send stuff independently together and have a fourth party set it up for them. I mean, that was unheard of. But, and of course, we're talking about Marcel Duchamp, Hannah Hoch, and the Dadaists, doing stuff like that. And I think it's amazing that the birth of their take on Cubism was very firmly rooted in, came from halfway across the world they had never encountered before and opened a whole new window for them. So I think that goes a long way in preparing us to explore the 20th century. And I have a little bit of a timeline for people that are interested in history, and then there's also just a retelling of some of the art movements and stuff of what we're going to be looking at. And then this is looking again at how we are looking at the art. And and especially this, I like to use photography because still today, people are dismissing photography as an art medium because there's no evidence of the artist within a photography, and I think that is one of the. I hope none of you feel that way, because I think that is really a misinformed perspective on the field of photography, because there is this underlying assumption that photography is just a direct relation of reality when it can't be. There has to be an intelligence focusing the lens. There has to be an intelligence setting up the camera and deciding how to format something, where to put the light, how to use the available light. Even if it is an automatic camera taking trail cam photos somewhere in the hinterlands of the panhandle of Florida, there had to be an intelligence setting up the camera and deciding how often to take the photos, which validates it as an art medium. And I think we can find same kinds of things in pretty much every medium that we explore. And whether or not we like it, that has it has very little bearing on whether or not something qualifies as being art. You guys have heard that the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? and that is taken as a universal altruism to inform our encounters with artifacts. And the reality is that is a huge steaming pile of manure. It's not a truism. It was first published in 1812 as a direct result of this commodification of art that was emerging from the Industrial Revolution. Beauty has very little, beauty, when we talk about beauty in relationship to art, has a lot more to do with things like intent and proportion and workmanship and material use and intention. It has a lot more to do with that than whether or not it's pretty. You know, beauty is something that we can each approach differently from our own perspective. The thing that is in the eye of the beholder is our perception, our understanding, and our reaction to the beauty, not the definition of the beauty itself. And I think that's a subtle but important distinction, because that removes the possibility of getting into, well, it removes the validity of getting into emotional arguments about whether or not this thing or that thing validates itself as art. Because we know that our emotional response is uniquely our own. I know that some of you most likely really, really like Thomas Kinkade, and some of you most likely probably do not. Whether or not his stuff is art has a lot less to do with your personal feelings about it, and a lot more to do with the intent and the workmanship and what he was doing. So, you know, I'm just putting that out there. His portraiture of Christ, he did a series of abstract paintings of Christ, which, and this, of course, predated his urinating on the Winnie the Pooh sculpture in Disneyland. But those were really amazing, you know, and really well done. The next part of the module talks about where contemporary, or not contemporary, but where modern art fits. And for the purposes of this, we're going to loosely describe modern art as the tail end of Impressionism, all the way up to Guerrilla Girls and 1999 about. Modern art is generally considered to be art that explores and pushes the boundaries of how people define art and how they see art. And it's less attached to the meaning and symbolism as it is to the process. And then you get postmodernism, which is more attached to the meaning and symbolism and explores ideas like process as an art event on its own. And but I think that those distinctions are kind of, I'm not going to say arbitrary, but they're difficult to define. And so when I say modern art in the context of this class, I'm going to use it inappropriately as a synonym for art during the 20th century. Is that okay with everybody? Is anybody going to be hurt? Okay, I'm sorry, Van. That's just the way I feel. But hopefully you guys can get over it. And there's a video I can do that in in this module that I want everybody to see that addresses that idea. Yeah, anybody can do that. But what makes it valid as an art piece, I think, is there needs to be somebody who is first. And there needs to be somebody who had the perspective, the gumption, and the chutzpah to do it first. You know, can you imagine if you weren't living on your own and you didn't have bipolar disorder? Can you imagine trying to exhibit like Starry Night or the Night Cafe or anything like that within the setting of the gallery system in 19th century France? I mean, he was pretty ballsy to be able to do that. And what's so fascinating about that is Van Gogh's work pretty much defines how we explore our relationship with the definition of art today. I think it's amazing. There's a video I absolutely love, and I will include it in the next module, but it's Doctor Who works with Van Gogh to save the world yet again. And because Van Gogh is the only person able to see the aliens that are slowly invading and taking over. And so Doctor Who rewards him by taking him to a contemporary gallery, and he has Bill Nye describe the importance of Van Gogh's work to Van Gogh. It's a really cool little 4-minute segment of just where a contemporary art critic is able to describe how important Van Gogh's work is to the artist, which I think would have been an incredibly cool experience. I just wish the TARDIS was real. Anyway, and then for your weekly reflection, we're going to have 14 of these. The weekly reflection is just an opportunity for you, instead of taking a quiz, to write 250 words about the stuff that you encounter as you're studying and learning about this material every week. And this first one, I expect to be more a reflection on the ideas that you encounter. If you want to apply the 4 tools of artistic critique to a specific work that you see, like that Paul Klee image, that's fine. But I expect that this is going to be more of a conceptual or idea exploration. And if you look down here, I just give kind of a real short example of a layout of potential weekly reflection, with things like, insightful stuff, yada yada, here, instead of what I actually might want to write. I will warn people that ChatGPT is one of those miracles of modern technology that is absolutely amazing. It is an incredible extrapolation of the statistical use of language. And that's entirely what it is. When you use ChatGPT as a tool in your writing, I'd like you to remember to use it just as a way to kind of outline or to generate a first draft, and then rewrite it in your own language. A dead giveaway when somebody turns in a ChatGPT paper is when in the middle of it, there's a statement, something along the lines of, I do not have an opinion about this because I'm only in a word analysis program. So please have the self-respect to at least rewrite the ChatGPT essay that you generate. Please. And I think it's important to use programs like that, because we're not going to get away from them. We might as well learn how to use them as a functioning tool. And as long as if you take work that is not your own and present it as your own, then it's cheating. But when you take a tool like that and use it as a tool to help you refine your writing, then it's just a tool, and it helps you organize your thoughts better. And I think that is entirely valid and a good thing to do. So, anybody have any questions? Anybody have any comments or observations that might be questions from other people that weren't attending live? Alrighty then. Does it kind of make sense what I'm hoping from people regarding the project proposal? Does that kind of make sense? Okay, because it is there to be a brainstorming device. And again, for this first project, I expect that everybody will be contacting me saying, hey, I have kind of an idea, can you help me flesh it out? Every time that I've done this, usually the first project or so is kind of tentative, but then after people see what other people do, that's what the discussion board is for. You're putting your projects on that so everybody else can see. Then everybody gets a lot more confidence, and they start producing absolutely amazing things. In previous classes, there was one person who did a lemon and pepper ice cream recipe that had its origination in 14th century Renaissance, or 15th century Renaissance. Somebody else was making Victorian sponge cake and Enlightenment era shortbread. One person made baklava and just was able to target the region in Turkey during the Ottoman era where the recipe originated from. And the thing that made them valid projects is they were all able to tie it into the subject matter of the class that they were taking at the time. So there's lots of different kinds of things that are pretty cool. The person who did the shortbread and the sponge cake was even able to find still lifes where she thinks that in the painting you can see the shortbread or the sponge cake that she made. And I thought that was pretty freakishly cool. The guy who did the lemon ice cream was able to find in one of the Renaissance artist notebooks a reference to it. And I thought that's pretty cool. If you can tie it into a class like that, that's great. So there's lots of different things. Another student actually went to the Virgin River. He he filmed himself finding a clay deposit, and he showed how to prepare it, and then he made a pinch pot and a coil pot using techniques that prehistorical societies very well likely have used. And that was really fascinating. So there's lots of kind of things. Well, if you guys don't have any questions, I recommend when you watch the playback, maybe slow it down so you could actually understand me. When I get excited, I start talking really fast. That when I took the booster shot for COVID vaccine, I didn't think I had any reaction to it, but my kids said I spoke. I reminded them of Remy the squirrel in that cartoon where the hyperactive squirrel takes a shot of caffeine and moves faster than the speed of light. So I lose myself. So hopefully everybody can understand. But if you don't have any questions, please go through the module, watch as many of the videos as you can. And again, if you don't get a perfect score on the things that you turn in, look at the comments that I've made, and you can always make those adjustments and then turn it in. The most common thing is when people use citations, not doing it in proper MLA format, and I include a link for you to reference, where you can even plug in the website and it will give you the format. And then also including the accessed on phrase at the end of that link, at the end of the citation. The accessed on phrase is vital, especially right now, because websites are constantly being updated. And if you find something from a source online, you need to have the access phrase after your citation so that you can go return to it, or somebody else can return to it, look it up on the date you accessed it, and see the same information that you had used. So that's why we need that too. But those two, and the third one is not alphabetizing the citations. Those are the three biggest problems that people had in all the papers. It was not, and projects, it was not doing the project or writing the paper. That's kind of the fun thing about Utah Tech. It's kind of relief. It's kind of a relief dealing with people that are more professional. It's kind of nice to see that. So I really appreciate that. But again, if you have any issues, any questions, or you want help articulating your project and connecting it to the material of the class, let me know and I'll do whatever I can. Okay?
Thank you.
Folks, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to seeing y'all next week on Wednesday as well. I think it'll be awesome.
That's good.
Thank you.